Hello and welcome to OEG's latest webinar. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Deirdre Fulton. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation and I'm moderating today's discussion. And this is now the 16th webinar that OEG has run since late March, where we dissect the latest position on the COVID-19 pandemic. Those of you who've joined us before will know the format that we follow. So we'll run through some slides and then we'll take questions and pose them to our panel. As ever, I'm joined today by John Grant, OEG's senior analyst, who, John, you've spent 6 months of your life on this, haven't you, so far, tracking the impact?
Yes, good afternoon, good morning. It feels like a prison sentence in some ways, doesn't it? But there is light at the end of the tunnel.
I think we all need a holiday. And on that note, we're joined also by our regular OEG experts, Matt Culling, EVP of Product Management. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Deirdre. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody.
So, as usual, we're going to use OEG's data to provide an overview of what's happening in terms of capacity and frequency at global, regional and country level. And then we'll take a deeper look into Europe and North America to some extent as well towards the end. It's peak summer season. It doesn't quite feel like that looking out my window today in a quite cloudy, overcast Scotland, but it certainly is summer and summer holiday time. So we'll take a look into what we're seeing and what we might expect in the weeks ahead over the summer for this part of the world. We'll take your questions as we always do, so please don't hesitate to pop them into the box as you go, and we'll answer some of them throughout, and we'll hopefully have time at the end. Everybody who's registered for today gets a recording of the webinar, so please don't worry about missing anything. You'll get the slides and also a recording of the audio. And OEG's this week has launched a traveller sentiment survey. So we'd really appreciate if you could take a moment or two to complete that. The link will be posted in the chat box as we go through the webinar. So I scrolled forward just a little bit too soon there, but let's jump into our first slide. So the heading sort of really says it all for me, not the summer that we hoped for. We've had a bit of a debate here about whether we should change the scale on this map, and would it be more positive to say that green started somewhere here between 100, minus 100 and 0, but it is what it is for now. So we're not seeing any green on the map yet, but we're certainly seeing a little bit less red, I think would be fair to say, John, wouldn't it?
Yes, we're certainly getting there, Deirdre. And if you compare this to the week of the 4th of May, when we were down at 26 million seats, it's almost it's fantastic the rate of growth we've seen in the last couple of weeks. In fact, some markets have doubled their capacity. Spain, for instance, growing from 500,000 seats a week to 1 million in the space of 2 weeks. So that's lots of deck chairs being filled, I guess, on the beaches in Spain and on the islands. So there is clearly some growth. Demand, I think, continues to lag way behind on the capacity that we're seeing being put back into the market. Still a very fragile demand position with lots of uncertainty and confusion out in the marketplace about what has to be done and how you can and cannot fly. I think the big challenge, of course, is the line that you alluded to on the right-hand side, where we should be looking to go from 49 to 68 million by the end of the month in terms of capacity. And realistically, as we've said for the last couple of months, that's beginning to look unlikely, if not impossible. We are seeing some airlines adding back capacity earlier than originally anticipated, which again is really positive. But for every piece of growth, we still see some markets where capacity is actually falling backwards. India is one that we'll come on and discuss. Obviously, the lockdown between New South Wales and Victoria will have an impact on one of the biggest air corridors in the world between Sydney and Melbourne. So it is swings and roundabouts, but the general trend is certainly beginning to look more positive.
We'll take that positivity. I think the fact that we've broken the 60% down feels like we were stuck below that for quite a long time. So it feels like we're moving in the right direction now.
Yeah, I think we're no longer water. We're trying to crawl out the mud now.
Yeah, well, yeah. That's a bit less positive than I was going with, but there we are. Okay, so let's look at the regions now. And you sort of alluded to this, didn't you? That we're seeing Asia slip back slightly, and underneath that is some changes in India. But we're seeing, look at Europe. You know, we've gone from minus 80 effectively to you know, below minus 70, which is it's a big step forward, isn't it? It's that capacity that you talked about just there.
Absolutely, it's amazing. It really is amazing how much capacity has been added back in the last 2 weeks on the key market flows, with Ryanair coming back on the 1st of July, EasyJet growing their capacity, and of course Wizz Air and others building out from quite low bases. But the challenge, not just for Europe, but for many of these markets, is the longer haul international sectors, where we're still seeing very little capacity coming back into the market. Most of what you see there in each of those geographic regions is regional point-to-point type services. You know, and those big international hubs, for instance, Emirates still only operating at 10% of their normal capacity levels because of the difficulties of just balancing out both sides of an international hub.
And we saw this morning, didn't we, that when we looked at, we do a sort of Asian focused webinar in the mornings when we run these, and we saw that China, for example, is sitting at minus 23, I think. You know, and some of the other countries across Asia, there's a 20 to 30% gap, isn't there, that isn't going to come back on until international free flow travel starts back up again.
Absolutely. China really does hold the strategic key to the return of commercial aviation back to anything near its previous levels. And, you know, for airlines like Cathay Pacific and Singapore and their respective hub airports, they are heavily dependent on the Chinese market. And of course, at the moment, they're allowed one flight a week on each city pair. And as time goes by in the next couple of weeks, if they can demonstrate that they've not brought any infected passengers into China, then they can begin to increase frequency. But for every plane or a group of passengers that arrive in China that are infected, there is a frequency reduction penalty that is going to be applied. Tell me how an airline can plan for that type of scenario. And you know, how does it actually change anything? Because all of those infected passengers could fly or be rebooked onto another airline if that airline cancels its service. So it's these sort of complexities and these bilateral decisions that are making it so difficult for airlines and network planners to come up with, you know, a solid recovery trajectory for their respective airlines.
I think this is the sort of you know, we talked a couple of weeks ago, and there's been a lot of press about bubbles and corridors, and you know, and all of those things. It feels like we're now into the sort of operational realities of that, or we're starting to contemplate some of that. You know, we also heard this morning about Australia, who are considering putting a cap on international arriving passengers. You know, reducing the number of international flights once they get started back up again. And so you can envisage that kind of action is what we're going to see across lots of different markets. You know, so the approach that China has taken, I suspect we'll see replicated in other places, won't we?
Completely. And, you know, was listening in on an interview that Al-Bakr from Qatar Airways was giving on last Friday, and he was saying ICAO have a set of standards, IATA have a set of standards, ACI have a set of recommendations, governments provide guidelines. No two of them are the same anywhere in the world.
And that just makes it nigh on impossible, doesn't it? For both sides, for airlines trying to navigate which countries they can operate into and what requirements there are, but also for the passenger, in terms of
For
where travel to,
the travel agent, for the airport, everyone, it's just really, really difficult. But we will find a way through this. There is a way through.
We need to, don't we? Yeah, we need to. Okay, let's look at our next slide. So we thought we'd break down what we just saw on the previous slide at the whole of Africa down into the regions to just see and take a look at what's going on there. It's a similar picture, isn't it, really, to the profile of other regions, but perhaps with a less of a recovery, maybe a little bit of a spike, and we morph from months here into the weeks of June. So recovery started, but has it stalled? Are we making any progress forward?
I think we have the challenges of South Africa, which the South African region, which of course is dominated by South Africa, and the ongoing Chapter 11 administrative type operations that South African Airways and Comair and others are working their way through at this moment in time. And the only region that's showing any real positivity is Eastern Africa, and that's predicated to a large degree on Ethiopian Airways. And I think an interesting point that we quite frequently forget about Africa is its reliance on inbound non-African domiciled carriers to provide that capacity. So, classically, a lot of capacity in Africa, certainly international capacity, was being provided by the big three Middle East airlines and by some of the European carriers. And of course, they're not back yet in any great scale or size. And that impacts the whole of the African market.
Yeah, absolutely. Or indeed, if they are back to Africa, the other end of the connection isn't back, and that's the disconnect we've talked about before, isn't it? Okay. Let's look now at some of the country level data. Now might be a bit busy this slide. So this is the table that we've been showing throughout, where we've got selected countries across Europe, Middle East and Africa here. And you can see, so this is frequency, so flights by month and then by week compared to the same week previous year. And it's that sort of cautious optimism, isn't it, that we're moving from the 80s to the 70s and the 60s to some extent now. And we can see quite a bold move here. We've got a slide that we'll come on to that'll look at that in a bit more detail, but a pulling back of that position for Qatar.
Yes, it's. I think what is very clear is the strength of the recovery we are seeing in some of the European markets. If you take Italy, for example, first week of June, only at 9% of the previous year's capacity, and now it's up to 33% of the previous year's capacity. And you look at Spain, and suddenly in probably less than 4 weeks, we've gone from just 7% of normal capacity to 31% of normal capacity. So there's a lot of seats being added back in now. A lot of them were added at short notice. So it does come down to this whole question about demand and demand recovery and speed of recovery. And I think we are going to talk about it, but Qatar Airways clearly very commendable, bold, brave, rash, whatever you'd like to describe it, but clearly their rapid return of capacity throughout June is not being carried through into July, and I suspect that they've probably lost quite a lot of revenue and cost and cash in those 4 weeks operating what were probably pretty empty aircraft for most of the time.
I think what's interesting is if we look at the box below this one, so this chart here, what you can see, so this is the cancellation rate at country level by week, starting way back at the beginning of April, and taking us up to the current week. And actually, what we've seen in other markets, and the reason we just sort of wanted to touch on this slightly, is that as the capacity sort of slug comes back in, cancellation rates have gone up until the market sort of levels off. But actually, we're not seeing that so much at the moment yet, are we? And is that a positive? Should we be taking comfort from that, or do we think that might change over the next few weeks? I suppose that's the unanswered question, isn't it, or the unknown question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think from my point of view, I think that we certainly, as you suggested, we predicted that on the recovery, as the capacity starts coming back in, the airlines will be testing the water, so to say, to try and find out what the right level of capacity might be. And we anticipated there may be kind of quite a rapid ramp up, but that would generate a lot of last minute cancellations, or to the points John was making around Qatar, potentially MTO aircraft. I think in Qatar's scenario as well, as we'll come on to this, is probably not just empty aircraft, but also those scheduled flights didn't operate. But the numbers of cancellations have certainly come down. They're now kind of in and around far more normal levels that we saw throughout 2019, in around sort of 1 to 2%, which we would consider to be kind of cancellations due to operational challenges as opposed to COVID-19, I think. So yeah, it's definitely come down a bit more manageable. I think when we've looked at some of the Asia data, it's noticeable that Japan still stands out as quite a substantially high cancellation rate. They've been kind of standing out, as I say, for a few weeks now, but even they are coming down from 30% a week or two ago down to some near 20 now. So I think it feels like it's the airlines getting control at the right level of schedule in order to meet the expectation, but I suspect we'll still get caught out, and some people will be caught out, such as we've already mentioned.
I think
we're going to see that.
Yeah, Deirdre, I think this is also a function of most markets that are now being operated by each individual airline still are at relatively low frequency. Either daily or weekly, and therefore the opportunity to cancel is much less than we are seeing in other markets. So one of the reasons we suspect there are such high cancellation rates in Japan is because those are high density city pairs, maybe 18 flights a day, and we're nowhere near back at that level of operation. So airlines are almost obligated to operate what they are now saying they're going to operate, because it's the minimum capacity they can put back into the market.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. Okay, let's look then at what we were just alluding to there in terms of a specific look at Qatar. So what we've pulled out here, and it might not be legible. I've got a very big screen here, so it is to me, but apologies if it's a little small. What we've got here is for Qatar Airways from the end of May through to the 5th of July. We've got flights scheduled to operate, and then the cancellation rate. And this is really the point we were making, around big surge of frequency potentially back into operate. Cancellation rate spiked up to 30 to 35%. It's come down a little, sitting now at 15 to 20%, and then this frequency figures come back down, and that might just be the sort of finding the right level, as you said, Matt.
Yeah, I think so, and I think the kind of the level of in and around the 150 flights that we're at now
Hmm.
beautifully correlates to the number of flights that we have definitive information that they operated as opposed to cancelled, and then there's sort of the grey area in between. So I think this is an example of Qatar Airways trying to find that right level of um, capacity for the market. You know, this is one scenario where we saw that spike in cancellations as they put the capacity back in, but
Hmm.
there are other examples where that hasn't happened and that the cancellation levels have remained fairly kind of managed and manageable. Um, so yeah, it's some slides we're coming onto talking about kind of different approaches from different airlines and how that then sort of, from my point of view as a sort of a someone who likes playing with the data, how that manifests itself in the data and the sort of different
Yeah.
cause and effects that we see. I think this is very much kind of what it would look like for an airline that went bold and went to put back capacity in a big way. Um, I think we've talked in the past about V shapes versus U shapes versus bathtub shaped recoveries, and you know, perhaps some of those airlines who try and drive the shape of the recovery by putting capacity back in. We saw some earlier in the season as well in Europe in the sort of the low cost market. Um, yeah, this may be kind of the reaction you get if you over estimate what capacity is required.
Hmm. And talking of playing with data, this is a product of a piece of work that you've done, which is another way of slicing this data, isn't it? Where for Qatar Airways, we can actually look at country level and see what the cancellation rates are across a range of different markets. And I guess that's interesting, isn't it, in terms of once we get further down the path of trying to understand how airlines are coming back and what that means in terms of serving particular markets, it's insightful, I think, to be able to drill into that level of detail, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think what this sort of data shows to some extent, or not entirely, but to some extent, is higher rates of cancellations to um, for Asian
Hmm.
markets than perhaps kind of the European side of things, and then Middle Eastern countries, some with a higher level of cancellations than others. But whether or not this is sort of Qatar's strategy or again driven by the travel restrictions in the different markets they fly to and from is to be researched, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. And we touched on this morning. We touched on this idea that actually right now, I think the traveller or the passenger is still potentially very tolerant of disruption, delay, cancellation. If you've got to the point of making the decision to travel just now, then I think you're willing to accept that as long as I get there at some point. I don't think that window of tolerance will last particularly long, but I think it probably is there right now, isn't it?
I think so, and I think also we have to sort of bear in mind that the countries in the world that operate um, situations like EU 261, where there's passenger compensation for delay and cancellation, um, you know, a lot of those rules don't apply at the moment if the airline can justify the cancellation or delay via use of COVID-19 as the reason. And so the financial implication of cancelling a flight or predominantly cancelling a flight, although it applies to delay as well, is not perhaps quite as significant as it would have been last year. So maybe that kind of enables the airlines to choose those flights that are the ones that they want to operate, maybe move the passengers, consolidate passengers into single operations, etc. So there's a little bit of additional leeway there as well to enable them to try and build back their network.
I think though that's one of the things that, oh, apologies, my dogs have decided to join the webinar. I think one of the interesting things is that this sense that the passenger is having to think about, if I book and I can't travel, will I get my money back? You know, there's a whole sort of issue there, isn't there, around around confidence, I think. You know, that's certainly what I'm hearing from people who are talking about, do we get away this summer? Do we get away in October? And it's for a variety of reasons. It's for, can you get travel insurance? Will you get your money back if you know, if the flight doesn't operate?
Deirdre, I think it's a really big issue at this moment in time, and you know, in some ways, what we've seen in those markets that have bounced back earlier than others is a short spurt of demand, which is pent up demand, either, you know, people wishing to travel for VFR reasons or for repatriation reasons or whatever they may be, and then almost a sort of standoff between capacity and demand, where those people who are desperate to travel have travelled, and the rest are uncertain about booking, and for all the reasons you outlined, you know, do not want to be giving airlines more cash to be turned into a voucher. You know, you can go to Sainsbury's and get vouchers. You don't need to go to British Airways. So it's, you know, it's that whole uncertainty, and I think that is the challenge for everyone, that, you know, with business travel effectively stalled because of duty of care and video conferencing, we're looking for the leisure sector to give us that kick start. But its booking window has become so much shorter in the last few months, so much shorter.
And to your point on vouchers, John, I think you know, from conversations I've had as well, particularly sort of business travellers who are still trying to get their refunds sorted, or they still have vouchers with airlines. You know, the idea of booking new flights before they've got those situations resolved isn't a particularly appealing one. So again, just passenger sentiment, passenger confidence, to your point, Deirdre, around, you know, that's going to be key, as much as the restrictions being lifted in certain countries and jurisdictions is, you know, enabling or allowing it to happen. The next hurdle is definitely going to be kind of getting the passengers to want to travel.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at what some airlines are doing to. Oh, we've have I skipped past that slide? I think our slides might have got slightly out of sync here. We'll come back to that one. Let's look at what some European airlines are doing then, in terms of how they're trying to, I guess, stimulate demand. You know, and we're not looking at pricing here, but in terms of what they're putting back in, there's lots of different things going on, aren't there? Right.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. So you have Wizz Air, of course, who we've discussed before, are brave and bold, but had this week cancelled and reduced the amount of capacity planned. But you know, they were very aggressive and early out of the doors, and this shows capacity through to the end of August, or the last full week of August. And then you have British Airways and Lufthansa, who, quite frankly, probably need a couple of electric shocks to get their networks moving again, because they seem to have stalled.
What is going on there?
I just wonder, you know, both of those airlines have made some quite dramatic announcements about redundancies, reorganisations, etc. And at this moment in time, going back to their employee bases and saying, we need to ramp up quicker than we originally planned and put capacity back in, would not be a message that would, one, endear itself to the employees, but also in a negotiating stance would actually lead the unions to be in a position to say, so it's not quite as bad as you thought it was going to be then. So, you know, I think that's part of their position at this moment in time, and they're going to miss whatever demand does come back, I think, and that will obviously play into next year, of course.
There's also the short haul versus long haul networks. Both carriers. I mean, Turkish is the exception, isn't it? But you know, both of these carriers have long haul networks, whereas EasyJet, Ryanair, and Wizz don't. Although Wizz are making a step in that direction, aren't they?
But it also, not only the long haul, Deirdre, but it shows their reliance on intercontinental to short haul connecting capacity, if this is all they've managed to put back so far. But, you know, rather than wondering about why other airlines are selling €7 fares, maybe these airlines should begin to inject some capacity back in, you know, and see what happens. It's the only way you're going to test it. EasyJet, I suspect that overstates their position.
Yeah, it looks ambitious, doesn't it?
We are seeing that EasyJet, and to Matt's point, you know, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, are making dramatic adjustments to their operation. If you look on their website, many of their flights are sitting there with the word sold out on, and there's, you know, some text underneath saying it's unlikely this flight's going to operate, and we're replanning, etc. So it's very different strategies by airlines, and very different levels of confidence. And, you know, I wonder, is that confidence in their own ability to stimulate the market?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and how interesting then that actually perhaps on, well, it might be a little bit of a competition between the boldest of carriers here, but, you know, the carrier that you might have expected to be boldly out there trying to convince us all to travel again has a very measured approach, don't they?
They do, but I think we can assume that they are very much on top of their game, and they have a very well thought through strategy that will reward their shareholders at the end of this, or minimise the risk to their shareholders as we go through this.
And I think that's the key, isn't it? You know, in terms of, we've talked before, haven't we, about carriers who may be well placed and may see this as, to some extent, an opportunity to make a land grab, or to, you know, to dominate in a market maybe where they didn't have the dominant share before. But that's a risky move, isn't it, in this kind of uncertain environment where demand is not guaranteed. You know, continuation of operation is not guaranteed, really, is it, for many carriers?
Absolutely not, mate. You know, this could be a long-term play by these two, saying, guys, help yourselves, blow your brains out during this summer. You won't make any money. We'll pick up what is left at the end of the period when the market has stabilised, and, you know, we can better manage capacity to demand.
To play the long game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. And then so from carriers up to country level, these are the charts that show what we showed you in the red table earlier. So really encouraging to see these European markets starting to pick up, but, you know, still nowhere near what carriers really need in terms of this. This is peak time, isn't it? May to September. It's when all the revenue comes in, typically. It's when Europe goes on holiday.
It's when the aircraft work to their maximum. You know, airports like Gatwick are seeing the last EasyJet flights arriving back at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the first one's going out at 6 o'clock in the morning, and utilisation is extremely high. Load factors are in excess of 95%, and the airlines are both taking lots of cash for tickets, but also ancillary revenues. And you know, it's a stark situation we face at this moment in time. When you see that bar chart on the right hand side, there is just so much capacity not there.
Yeah. And you know, when will it come back? We can't answer that, can we? We don't. We've got to get through the summer.
Yeah, you certainly can't see it coming back. You know, the graph tells you it's not going to come back this summer. It's not going to come back during the winter, because that would be madness. Although they do write some good songs. But, you know, it's summer 2021, and it would be a brave airline to put all of its summer 29 capacity back in. You would want to see how the market was developing, and where we were with COVID-20 before you came back.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at our next slide. So important. You know, we've talked really on sort of short haul Europe mostly, and obviously acknowledged that BA and Lufthansa are not back quickly, or back in any sort of major sense yet. So we thought we'd take a look at the transatlantic market and just give you some insights into what that's currently looking like, because it's an important revenue generator, as we'll see in our next slide. So you can see here that so the grey bars are last year by carrier operating transatlantic between Europe and North America. And there's a consistent story, isn't there, you know, in this market, and that's really because of the limitations on travel between these markets right now.
Yeah, it's a market that you know, unless you're a privileged position or a diplomat, or you have a particular passport and you want to go in one direction or other, it doesn't work. It doesn't exist as a market, and the airlines capacity reflects that. This is, you know, this is the most lucrative market in the world at this time of the year, with very high load factors. Yes, the actual yields do fall back in August as you get more leisure than business travelers, but certainly June, July, and September are, you know, the most lucrative months for nearly every transatlantic operator. And when you're seeing this level of capacity, this is an indication of how deep the losses are for these airlines, but also the implications as it stretches into the winter are extremely significant.
So on that, John, we wanted to put some numbers on it in terms of trying to quantify what it actually looks like. Now, we can see, so on the left here, we're showing you seats by country in the transatlantic market from Europe. It's a big important market to the UK, clearly, Germany and France, accounting for just over 50% of seats operating over the Atlantic. Now, in terms of, but the really interesting figures are on the right here. The combined daily revenue, so this is daily revenue, not anything more aggregated than that, for carriers operating in these markets is $46 million. I mean, that's just a stunning figure when you think about how long carriers have effectively not been able to operate in this market.
Yeah, it is. In the time it took you to explain that, which was about a minute, Deirdre, that would have been $32,000 worth of revenue. It is staggering, and for some airlines who, you know, have enjoyed the benefits of geographic position in both the United Kingdom and perhaps to a lesser degree the Republic of Ireland, and therefore invested lots of capacity into their North American operations, and particularly US operations. This is a killer blow. This is big money being lost just at the wrong time. You know, revenue that is just out of reach and cannot be touched.
And it's lost. It's lost opportunity. It's never coming. That opportunity's gone.
It's a perishable product. It's like a Wimbledon strawberry. You know, it's completely perishable and it's gone. And of course, the challenge here is, where I think about 1 week through the first 2-week red light status for the US from the European Union, it will be reviewed again next week, very unlikely to be changed. And at that point, you can kiss goodbye to any real increase in capacity or demand in August and September. The transatlantic summer season has been a complete, just a complete washout for every carrier. It's very, very worrying.
And you know, it's interesting to see. I was having a look earlier at some of the things that airports around Europe and beyond are doing to support carriers. And Heathrow have come up with an incentive scheme to try and incentivise growth. Now, the total value of what they're offering across all of the carriers that operate at Heathrow, so this is not transatlantic but by any means, is 40 million. Now, at 14 million a day, You know, and I mean that's not all Heathrow, but the bulk of it, is it's a drop in the ocean, isn't it?
It is a drop in the ocean. It's a gesture, and you know, the sentiment is absolutely right. The number sounds big in the context of the aviation industry. It's not that huge, but you do wonder what would be the impact if the UK government actually did something rather than talked about that they're in discussion with everyone and waived APD, for example, for a 12-month period, what the impact would be and how that would help stimulate demand. Because, you know, for a family of four traveling across the Atlantic on holiday, either into the UK to spend money or vice versa, the taxation is extremely high in a period when airlines need help. So it's extremely frustrating to live in the United Kingdom and see all these government bailouts and supports and initiatives around the world. And you know, Boris can't decide whether we can play cricket yet.
I knew there would be a cricket reference.
There you go.
Squeezed in somehow. Okay, I think so what we are showing now is, let's move across to North America. We're looking at the same same picture that we showed for Europe by carrier for the big carriers in the US and Canada. And there's a different approach, isn't there? I mean, it's a different context, isn't it? It's largely domestic market, isn't it?
Yeah, different context. Protected, of course, by the support of the CARES Act that runs through to the end of September. But you can see there seems to be a bit more longer term planning and thought through this, and for all of the faults of the CARES Act, and there are probably many, and you know, airlines are not entirely happy with the structure. It has provided a degree of protection around capacity and the continuation of air services. And we've seen some numbers about how TSA, and we'll show some numbers about TSA volumes and throughputs. So it has provided that degree of continuity about supply, whereas in the United Kingdom and in Europe generally, we just look at the planned capacity from the airlines, and the first thing we say is that's not going to happen, is it?
It does just feel like, you know, after the sort of initial high level of cancellations and, you know, unsettled period back in April, it feels like the US carriers in particular really have had their house in order in terms of, you know, putting a plan in place and making that work. If we skip back up a couple of slides to this one, you know, we've seen cancellation rates level right off, haven't we? You know, after that sort of spike, we've seen frequency just steadily come back, haven't we? In both the US, it's a bit behind in Canada, but it feels like just a more planned, more specific journey back, and I guess that's it's reflective of the domestic market, isn't it? In the US, that's the big.
But wait until October, when the CARES Act runs out, and airlines are already, you know, making plans for furloughs, redundancies, adjustments to their operations, because that support will no longer be there, and they'll have to operate in a much more commercial framework, and that is inevitably going to lead to changes in the networks, you know, and perhaps by the end of September we'll see some international capacity coming back, or the potential for international capacity to come back into the transatlantic market. So there'll be adjustments between domestic and international flying for sure.
I think there's also the sort of uncertainty, isn't there, about second waves in the US. You know, we have seen certain states in the US more impacted in recent weeks. We've heard talk of you know, between state travel restrictions. So I think that's going to play out as well, isn't it? Over and then there's the sort of the return in September to school and college and all of those.
Well, you know, the Florida spike sufficiently spooked TUI that it cancelled its whole summer 2020 program to Florida and essentially said we're not returning until April 2021, and anyone who wants to fly on a TUI package will put on a scheduled airline.
Yeah.
And the really one of the interesting things is how we get through the whole winter, Deirdre, because a lot of people who planned to travel in late April, May, and June on holiday to the US, you know, were spending lots of money on perhaps a family holiday of a lifetime, have just rolled over their booking to next year. So they have a booking, they've paid for it. There is no more cash for the airline to generate from that passenger because they probably fully paid for their airfare. So we're going to enter a winter which is going to be uncertain. And then for the next 3 months or the first 3 months of summer 2021, the airline's ability to generate more revenue for the immediate summer is zero because they've probably filled a lot of their seats with traffic that should have been carried in 2020.
And is that the point at which you know, remember there's lots of aircraft parked up? Is that the point at which, you know, the plan on paper certainly is that more aircraft come back into service, and you know, you've then got a little bit of opportunity to flex up get capacity on that basis? I don't know.
Dust down the engines, fire them up and see if you can create more demand, or for those few seats that you do have left, sell them at a much higher yield than you normally would and enjoy the benefit.
Feels a bit marginal though, doesn't it? If that all feels a bit marginal.
Yeah, it certainly does. I think I'd sell those extra 20 seats for another £50 and look to take a bit more revenue and take a pause and see what happens after that initial period.
Yeah. Okay. Let's flip back down to where we were. Apologies everybody for that, having been in the slightly wrong order there. So we were talking about the US carriers and what they've put back into the market. American in particular have been quite optimistic, haven't they, this week? Now, you don't really see that on this chart because this happened from last week to this week, but they've gone back in quite a big way, haven't they, this week? An extra 1 million seats back into the domestic market in the US. And what we thought would be interesting to show would be, well, what's the distribution of that capacity like? And what we're showing you is across the main bases that they operate from, to what extent are they putting a bigger share of capacity in compared to last year? So at their main hub, what you can see is actually a focus on exactly that. So 18% compared to the relative share last year, which was 14.6%. Similarly, Charlotte, a higher focus, and that's what you would expect, wouldn't you, John? You'd expect the focus into the main hubs of operation.
I would certainly expect them to focus on those hubs, and particularly those that are sort of centric on the US mainland. So clearly Dallas is, you know, a huge winner through this. Currently the world's busiest airport, which is a big shout out to them, but also Charlotte. And I think the interesting thing about Charlotte is it's a major hub in a sort of northeast to southeast and Caribbean corridor. And I just wonder whether consciously American have eased out their capacity growth in Miami, given the spike in COVID activity in Florida, and have been consciously decided to route some more stuff through Charlotte. Very similar flows, particularly to the Caribbean. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Of course, both the East and the West Coast are much more dependent on transatlantic and trans-Pacific international sectors, which are just out of reach at this moment in time and not operating. But big shout out to American. It's 1 million extra seats, and I think United added 75% more capacity week on week. So clearly, you know, there's a feeling of growing confidence, and it may be the euphoria of the 4th of July.
Yeah. Okay.
I guess one aspect that the US airlines have as an advantage, though, in the kind of the CARES Act, though, is that kind of comfort blanket they've had to test the water and understand what the demand is, particularly on the domestic side, obviously, has given them an opportunity to build back. And if you look at the way the schedule in the US is growing, it is a fairly steady sort of hockey stick shaped curve. There's another one, not bathtub, but a hockey stick. And so it has been very steady growth returning, both, and we're seeing some international capacity coming back, as you said, as well as the domestic. So I guess that they've had an opportunity to plan for how the recovery will come, what that demand might be, as opposed to some of the European airlines that have had to throw sort of more capacity on and understand, test, if you like, live what the demand is going to be.
Yeah.
Although I guess to some extent they've also had to, the US carriers have had to maintain a certain level of operations, haven't they, at the point at which they might not have, you know, they might not have wanted to, and I guess there's an associated cost with that, isn't there?
There is.
There's definitely a cost, yeah. Sorry, John, you were saying.
So building back the hubs, you know, we're not going to see so many small, thin markets being served for a time. You know, those hubs are going to become increasingly important for some airlines as they build back out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the sort of one of the interesting things, isn't it, to see how when we eventually get through the worst of this, to look back and look at what would these be sort of structural changes in terms of how airlines decide to deploy their capacity. Will we see passengers? It's the whole debate, isn't it, about will you connect or will you want to fly direct and just take one flight rather than be in another airport where you're not sure about what things look like. It's all of that sort of uncertainty, but it's going to be interesting to look back and see whether we see some sort of structural change as a result of this or not. So last slide here, we've got the TSA data that you referenced earlier, John. So, and this it's an interesting picture, isn't it? I mean, it points very slightly towards cautious recovery starting here in terms of what we're showing is seats in 2019 and seats in 2020, and then the TSA screening data from 2019 and then from 2020. So it looks like it's going in the right direction, doesn't it?
It does, and of course, you know, we're showing up to the 28th of June. And last week's data, which is just coming on board, will show that the 4th of July public holiday will undoubtedly have led to a spike in that as well. So it is, you know, this is some of the best data in terms of actually measuring what is really happening. And I think it does point exactly to that, Deirdre, that we are seeing a bounce back. But we need that international connectivity because, you know, for every 4 or 5 domestic passengers in the US, we're still missing that one international passenger that would be able to travel. Yeah.
And of course, we've seen just on the transatlantic market how much revenue these routes generate. Okay, let's move on now to, we've got a little bit of time left for some questions, and we've seen some questions come in throughout. Any that catch your eye instantly, John?
There's one here about the ban. What are your thoughts on the impact of airline capacity and flight schedules from the ban on American residents traveling to most countries? Well, I think we answered that, Jean. I think it's devastating. It's devastating for not just the aviation industry, but for the whole tourism and hospitality sector, both in the United States and in Europe and Asia. you know, someone asked me what are the key pivotal points that will change the outlook for the next couple of months, and one of them is please in the US, you know, get hold of this COVID spike and find a way to overcome that, and the other one is Chinese international capacity and that coming back. They are two major factors that I think are impacting us. And following on to that, there's a question on quarantine requirements on demand for airline travel. Well, absolutely damaging demand, but it's, you know, very, very difficult for anyone to book with confidence and to then have doubt about whether they're going to be quarantined and how long they're going to be quarantined for. And Deirdre mentioned earlier that, you know, both the Australian and New Zealand governments, I think, are now suggesting that the individual is going to have to pay for the quarantine rather than taxpayer. You know, so that's $80 a night in a 3-star Premier Inn or Quality Inn type property for everyone that they don't particularly want to pay for. So I think that will just dampen demand even more.
And, you know, from both sides, from a leisure perspective, that's not where you want to spend your leisure time, is it? And from a business perspective, you know, equally, you're not going to go unless, you know, unless your business trip is of a duration that means that works. It's, you know, and the average business travel stay is 3 to 5 days, isn't it? You know, so it just, until we unlock that, until that changes, it's making it really hard for people to travel and do that kind of trip.
Yes, I agree. I mean, Matty has asked, is this capacity sustainable from September onwards when leisure demand softens, business traffic doesn't return? I think that's a very good question, and that really is the great unknown. You know, it's going to be really hard to sustain the levels of capacity unless we see demand coming back very quickly. Rodolfo's asked whether airlines should offer testing as part of their ticket cost. Well, I think it's a good idea, but I just think it's about the practicalities of it. I think it's also around the consistency of testing. Unless there was a uniform supplier of that testing that everyone accepted around the world, it's a great idea, but, you know, quite often in these occasions, it's the execution and implementation that makes it difficult to pull through, which is frustrating.
Yeah, it's we sort of waver between cautious optimism and pessimism at the challenges ahead, don't we? Often on these webinars, and I think I think it's, you know, we mentioned, I think it was actually in this morning's webinar, that there's a huge element, isn't there, of particularly in leisure travel, where people will listen to positive stories from other people. So the power of, well, I went to wherever and it was fine actually, and we got there and we got back and it all worked, and you know, it happened. That's also true of business travel, isn't it? You know, in terms of events, and we talked this morning about the Olympics and whether the Olympics will happen. And that could be a fantastic opportunity, couldn't it, for Japan to demonstrate actually we can handle a big event. You know, the positive, and if they could pull that off and make it work, then I think the positive message that would send around people's willingness to then travel is where we need to get to, isn't it? You know,
it is.
Positive examples, don't we?
We do, and you know, if you asked any tourism board or stakeholder community who's dependent on travellers and tourism for, you know, a large part of their GDP, they would say we need a big event, we need a big event to kickstart demand, and clearly the Olympics is the biggest event in the world. And if you can host it for essentially zero new cost because you've already built and paid for the infrastructure that was going to get wasted this year, then of course you'd be excited, but you've got to handle it, and you've got to put the right processes, and make sure the right checks are in place, and it's a logistical challenge. But if anyone's going to pull it off, it's going to be the Japanese. I think they're well placed to put those sort of processes in from what I've seen in the past.
Yeah, to do that. Okay. We're just about out of time. Any final thoughts from you, John, or from you, Matt, as we wrap up?
No, we are seeing a recovery of sorts. Capacity is coming back. We need to rebuild consumer confidence, and I just laugh when I see the mixed messaging from some airlines who tell me they leave the middle seat of their aircraft empty because that's going to help them. It's going to help travellers be reassured, and that same airline says, well, don't worry about the middle seat because the air in our cabin is 8 times fresher than it is in your local grocery store. It's a bit of a mixed message there. I'm not sure they got that strategy right, but we are seeing a recovery of sorts. But I keep saying, and I repeat, it is not about this summer that we need to start to worry. We need to think about what happens from the end of October through to the end of March, and how we're going to help the airlines and the aviation industry through what is probably going to be an even harder time than the initial COVID-19 event.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you again for your insights, John, and Matt, to you for sharing your thoughts about the data and the sort of associated implications of that. Thanks to those of you for listening and your questions, always interesting. If we haven't answered any, we will get back to you in the next couple of days, but I think we've done a reasonable job of getting through most of them. As we said earlier, OAG have a traveller sentiment survey, so we'd encourage you please to take a moment to fill that out and help us understand more about sentiment. And feel free to share it with your network too, because the more insight we get, the more ability we have to try and understand what's driving the recovery. So we'll send a recording of the webinar out to everyone. Thanks for that. And if you want to see any of the pieces of analysis that we have covered today and in previous webinars, you can follow the coronavirus dedicated page on OAG's website, where you can download some of the data and you can sign up for regular updates. So when we update that, you'll get a notification. Thanks everybody for coming along, and we'll hopefully see you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.